Welcome to Alpena Community College Association of Lifelong Learners. Today we have a group called Granite Gardens, and they're going to make a presentation about Sheriff Charles Lynch. I'd like to welcome Amanda Kuznicki, who will be our first speaker, and she'll introduce everybody else. Thank you.
I promise theatrics, I'll give you a little. Hello, first off, we want to say thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for your interest in Sheriff Lynch and Blinky Morgan and the story we're about to share with you. My name is Amanda Kuznicki, and we have Kat Tomaszewski over here and Mr. Mike Phillips. Together, along with many other community members, we make up a group called Granite Gardens. We like to do a little bit of cemetery preservation. We like to do a little bit of history research. So we're kind of a well-rounded group. We are very excited to share the story filled today. It's filled with twists and turns, okay? Triumphs and woes. We're going to take you on a ride. This tale will take us back in time, okay? Across state lines, and ultimately right back here into the community that we all love, Alpena, Michigan. So without further ado, because I want to make sure that we get this program started, I'm going to bring you Badges, Bullets, and the Demise of Blinky Morgan.
What an awesome introduction. Hopefully I have power. Was just trying to get, I didn't know if I'd be able to see the presenter notes here, as I have in my presentation.
Testing 1, 2.
Do I need to go back? All right, so we'll go to the next slide, please. And here I just, going through the digitized newspapers, it was neat to see that they list all of the county officers that year. And I was able to build a picture of Charles Lynch's investment to our community. So you'll see here in 1883, he was the undersheriff. In 1884 and 85, he was the undersheriff. And the next slide, please. 1886, he was the undersheriff. He also served in many different positions of local leadership, including as an alderman. And he was undersheriff for 4 years prior to becoming the sheriff in 1887. And the next slide for me, please. Now I included this in here because I wanted to give a little perspective on Alpena's first jail. This was the jail that the sheriff worked out of. This was also the jail where Blinky Morgan and his gang would have been held. I think it's very interesting, the parallels of the present to the past. As I was researching this, and especially a lot extra last year, which is when we discovered the photo of him, we were going through the process of leaving our third jail and coming to our current jail. And while Charles Lynch was undersheriff, he was not only campaigning to be the next sheriff, but campaigning for a new jail. So I included a few of those details in here because I thought they were fascinating. Yes.
This is located across from the county courthouse. Is that the existing
N-
county courthouse?
Yes. Yeah. So this would have been where the prosecutor's office is now, over there by district court in the big parking lot.
This would have been called Market Square back in the day. We played softball behind the jail.
No way. That's very cool to play softball behind the jail. But I'm happy that you have that perspective because you got to experience our second jail that stood there. That history is so valuable for people to have that. So go ahead and go to the next slide for me, please. Because I've also clipped some of the way the news reported about the first jail. So they had found that the first jail was in dilapidated condition. It was unhealthy, unsafe, and they recommended that a new jail be built, and they were accepting bids. Next slide. And this is in here, so if you want to watch the replay and kind of read some of those articles, I've put them in there. But the number one reason they wanted to, not only was the building in disrepair, but it was unsafe and it was not secure. They couldn't keep the criminals in, and it was easy for somebody to have broke in or to break out. And that was a big part of their campaign for the new jail. And the community was very, very supportive. If you go to the next slide for me. There were a few people against it, but for the majority, they were for it because they knew that with all the people coming in and out of our town with the growing industries, we needed to have somewhere secure. And so go to the next slide for me, please. So just another great clipping of them talking about how close the jail was to be completed. And the next slide is our second jail that was constructed in 1887. This photo was taken in 1888. Unfortunately, I'm going to give you some perspective. Sheriff Lynch saw the beginning stages of the building of this jail. He saw the foundation be built. He saw some of the brickwork be done. But when he passed away in August of 1887, the jail was still 3 months from being finished. So he never saw the completed product that he worked so hard to have built for our town. And this jail stayed in use until the mid 1950s, and the Johnson Street location was constructed.
What have fallen women?
That's a great question. Yeah, right. And I will say that I go ahead and go to the next slide for me. because I want to take a moment to recognize the type of reporting that took place back then. News would not be reported this way now, but we had a very unique perspective into the time because the reporting style was really honest and very candid. And with that, I'm very grateful because it gave us such an interesting perspective. All right, so the next slide just says that when it was finished, there were 12 cells. And then the next slide shows you just a different angle of the new jail. And now we're going to get into the best part, the story of Blinky Morgan and Charles Lynch. So I have here on the next couple of slides, 12 lawbreakers, yes. It was really a beautiful building. Who here had a chance to see that jail while it was still standing? Yes.
It's the same jail we played softball. when I was 10
Mhm.
years old.
That is so cool. And it was in a beautiful location. The river was just behind it, so I could see that. So go ahead and go to the next slide for me, please. And this is where we're going to start talking about Blinky Morgan. So in early 1887, January of 1887, publications were sent across the country looking for these 4 subjects. They were wanted for robbing a fur store. They were known as the Cleveland Fur Robbers. So Charles Morgan, he's the second from the right, was the head of the gang. And their original intention that day was to break into the store and then break into the safe and steal a lot more than they wound up taking, but they were unsuccessful in their attempts to get into the safe. So they just took as many furs as they could and they hit the road. So they're all out on the run. Ohio detectives, Cleveland detectives get word that one of the men was located out of town, and they sent 2 of their best detectives to extradite him back to Cleveland to answer for his part in the crime. While they were transporting him back, they had 2 detectives on a train. They were transporting him back. The train stopped in Ravenna, Ohio, and some men got on. And they were there for one reason, to get their friend back. They attacked the officers in an effort to free their friend, beating both of them, shooting at them. They used a coupling pin from the train. Detective Hulligan died in that struggle, and the other officers survived but had major injuries. That meant that these guys were now on the run, the rest of them, all 4 of them, and they were a major danger to society. Next slide, please. And the next slide. And how lucky for us, because they came to Alpena. Of all places. There is a lot of speculation on why they came to Alpena. They say that one of the sisters married, that Blinky Morgan was the brother-in-law to Mrs. Williams. And Mrs. Williams and her husband lived here in Alpena, and he was a bookkeeper for a brewery here. And he lived at the corner of, next slide, please, 3rd and Lockwood, where the parking lot is now. And the next slide for me, please. The Williams family was considered a highly respectable family in Alpena. And so they were the last house anyone would expect some bad people would be hanging out. But there were quite a few really interesting things that happened here. And I'm going to give a lot of credit to Alpena's law enforcement for, back in the day, there was a lot of gossip, but they took these tips extremely seriously when no one else in Ohio would take them seriously. And that is what I give credit to for the capture of Morgan. So the first tip, one of Mrs. Williams' friends was out and about and she wanted to stop by and she was going to pop in on Mrs. Williams. So she goes up, she knocks on the door. No one answers. So she lets herself in. And when she opens the door, there's this guy sitting there and she has no idea who this is. And all of a sudden, Mrs. Williams comes flying in. She's all flustered. She has no idea what to say. And she's just like, it's Mr. Williams, my brother-in-law. Okay, right? Problem solved. This is who it is. No big deal. So the friend does her thing. She leaves. Later that week, another lady stopped by to see Mrs. Williams. She didn't let herself in, but she could hear a bunch of people inside moving around. And when she knocked on the door, all fell silent. So she thought that was a little suspicious too. Well, let's go back to the first lady now. So it's later in the week. She's down on the street. She runs into Mrs. Williams and Blinky's just out walking around with her. They're just strolling through town. And Mrs. Williams introduces him as Mr. Jones, her cousin from Boston. Right. Totally forgetting that this other encounter had happened. And I don't know about you, but I don't know how you would forget that encounter, to be honest. So this unidentified woman who never is named in the newspaper goes home and tells her husband. And he's like, yeah, this is more than just small town gossip. We've got something going on here. And he calls up the sheriff. So next slide for me, because there's even more. It just keeps adding up. So next slide again. All within this short period of time, Mrs. Williams' son was playing with one of his friends from school. And you know, little boys, they love to talk about their cool uncle or whoever it is in their family. And he's telling his friend about his uncle, whose name is Charles Morgan. Well, the little kid probably had been hearing enough from his parents and some of the scuttlebutt around town, went home and told them. They called up the sheriff, and that's when Charles Lynch knew that we had a problem on our hands. So you can go ahead and, well, we'll stay here for a second. I want to give Charles Lynch credit because he knew, based on all this information he was getting, what we had going on up here. He reached out to Ohio, and Ohio was like, yeah, no. We have tips that two of them are in France, one's in South America. Why on earth would they come to Alpena? You know, and Alpena back then was a big deal, but they didn't believe it. And so he actually went down to Ohio, spoke to them, and he was willing to pay to have them sent up here. So he was kind of on his own for part of this. So go ahead and go to the next slide. And I'm going to grab a story here. I wanted to tell the story exactly the way it was written in the newspaper in June of 1887. I do want to, on this slide, we'll show you that Charles Lynch, Under Sheriff Denton, some deputy sheriffs, Marshal Westrop, and policeman A.E. Westrop were involved. All right, so are you ready for this? This is the story. Some 5 weeks ago, Casper Alpern and another citizen of our place obtained information which led them to suspect the two strangers were stopping at the residence of Mr. Williams on 3rd Street and were part of a gang concerned in the Cleveland fur robbery and in the killing of Detective Hulligan. They continued investigating it. I'm going to skip some of this because it's redundant, and conveyed it to Sheriff Lynch. On June 18th, Alpern and Lynch telegraphed to the Cleveland police to send a detective to Alpena and offered to pay the expense, but Cleveland refused. George W. Jones, who was a former deputy, was given the important position of shadowing the men to see that they did not go out of town. He rented a room in a house opposite to Mr. Williams, and for several days kept a constant and vigilant watch on the men. He had an opera glass by which he could readily scrutinize the men when they showed themselves. Jones had many opportunities to see the men, and he became convinced beyond a doubt that the men were the one wanted. A third man, Billy Harrington, joined the party on June 17th. When the men left the house to take a stroll, they were followed by Jones, who also found means to notify Lynch and Denton of the fact. These officers would at once hasten to get an opportunity to view the men, but sometimes were not successful as the men would return home before the officers could see them. Alpern also kept watch on the 18th and got a good view of the men. On Monday, June 20th, the three men managed to leave on the steamer Atlantic, going as far as St. Ignace. But on Friday, the 24th, they returned back to Alpena. Jones's watch of the men was so skillfully done that they did not suspect they were watched, and his work of shadowing these men reflects great credit on him. On Saturday, June 25th, Sheriff Lynch was in Cleveland and had an interview with Superintendent of Police Schmidt, who showed Lynch the original photographs of the criminals. He also thoroughly informed Lynch as to the desperate character of the men and that they would not be taken without a fight. The superintendent also told Lynch that he did not believe the men were in Alpena and that he had a reliable source telling him that 2 were in France and 1 in South America. Sheriff Lynch asked the Cleveland police official to send a detective to Alpena to identify the men and even offered to pay the expense, but the superintendent refused. In the meantime, Jones was keeping a vigilant watch on the men here, and on Monday evening, June 27th, he saw 2 of the gang leave the house with bundles. At that time, he knew that the City of Mackinac steamer was about to leave for Detroit. He notified Alpern, who told Lynch that the men were leaving, and they followed them to the steamer. So they capture them. One of the criminals, now known as Jack Coughlin, entered the boat first and proceeded to the upper deck at the bow of the boat, being followed by Denton, Jones, McDonald, and Connors. As soon as he was located, Jones returned to where Sheriff Lynch was, and these two were about a short time or were interested in getting the other member of the gang, Billy Harrington. He was also taken by surprise and made no resistance, was handcuffed and relieved of his revolver. Jones went to where Denton was and the other 2 deputies who were watching Coughlin, who was supposed to be Pat Hanley. He whispered the news of Harrington's arrest, and then Denton and Jones quickly arrested the man and took his revolver away. They took him back to the police station, and here's a really interesting story that was noted in another version of this story in the Alpena News. And this is taken directly from the Alpena Argus back then. Their capture was quite easy as they were hilariously drunk and quite easy to apprehend. Under Sheriff Denton took them back to the county cooler where Sheriff Lynch and the rest of Alpena's finest law enforcement found their way to the Williams residence. Sheriff Lynch told City Marshal Westrope and Policeman Westrope that it was time to go capture Morgan. They had the 2 of them at the back door of the Williams residence, and George Jones was at the side door, and Sheriff and McDonald and Connors were to enter through the front. This is where it gets good, so hold on to your seats. So it's about 9 or 10 at night in June, so you know this is dusk. Sheriff Lynch, followed by McDonald and Connors, entered the house by the front door. Lynch was slightly knocking, but not pausing in his course, and just walked right into the parlor. It was a double one with folding doors, but the doors were open, making the 2 rooms practically one. At the far end, seated in an armed rocking chair, was the desperado whose life was one of crime and bloodshed. He was gazing at a bouquet of flowers, no suspicion that the officers were about to pounce on him. And he heard the noise, and in his mind, he felt secure, if such a man could feel secure. But men like Morgan never feel perfectly safe. They are always armed and always ready. They know that law is liable at any moment to reach for them, and in Morgan's case, capture meant death. The distance from the sheriff to Morgan was about 20 feet. Morgan heard the noise, looked up, saw the sheriff and his 2 deputies rushing into the room. Like a flash, his hand went into his pants pocket. Lynch saw him make this motion. Jones was standing outside the window and also saw Morgan reach for his revolver. He heard Lynch cry out, "None of that," and saw him rush to the prisoner, strike him, and knock him down. Jones then rushed into the room, found Mrs. Williams looking at the scene through a doorway. I can't imagine what she was thinking. The door being partly open, he pushed her aside, entered the room where the struggle was going on. Morgan was on the floor, and Lynch, Connors, and McDonald were holding him and trying to get the revolver from him. Because of the arms on the rocking chair, Morgan was unable to draw the revolver from his pocket, but his hand was still able to grasp it, and he was able to pull the trigger. Suddenly, the sheriff cries out, "I'm hitting the leg, but don't let go of him." Morgan succeeded in firing 2 more shots, but they did no harm. Both Lynch and Connors by this time had a hand on Morgan's throat. Jones then got Lynch's handcuffs and said, "Let me kill the beep," and that's how they reported it in the news. It's just, "Let me kill the blank, 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 blank." I love the reporting. At this time, at the same time, he took the handcuffs and hit Morgan over the head. Some of those present say the revolver was out of Morgan's pocket when it was discharged, and that Connor's hand was burned by the powder. Morgan said, "I quit, I give up." And Marshal Westrope and Policeman Westrope were now in the room. Morgan was handcuffed and 2 revolvers taken from him. He started to whine, and as soon as he surrendered, saying that he had shot himself in an effort to be let loose, and made a considerable fuss. But an examination showed that he was not injured in the least. He was taken to the police station and searched. The prisoners were well guarded and closely watched, and the next evening the officers arrived from Cleveland and identified them. So news travels fast. Now this part I really love, because the news says, "We regret we have not had the ability to record in proper manner the heroic conduct of Sheriff Lynch and his 2 deputies who followed him into the house that day. The sheriff knew what a determined and resolute desperado Blinky Morgan was, sitting 20 feet away, and that he was well armed and that human life was nothing to him. Lynch knew he had to travel those 20 feet before Morgan could draw his revolver, or death would meet him suddenly. He also knew that if he didn't act quickly, Morgan could have also shot him and his 2 deputies that entered him that day. Yet they never hesitated. They knew that they needed to reach him quickly and disarm him before he could assume their offensive. To do such deeds requires courage, determination, and promptness. The Cleveland officers could hardly believe that we had made this capture and that no one had been killed. Sheriff Lynch, however, had been shot in the knee. So go ahead and fast forward a couple slides here for me. You can skip that one and that one. So they searched the men and they found 4 revolvers, cartridges, dynamite cartridges, masks, a dark lantern, and a lot of other burglar implements. At this point, the doctor took Lynch to his office and extracted the bullet from his leg. Nobody thought anything of it. It was just a simple shot. It hit him 6 inches above the knee, and the bullet lodged just behind the back of his kneecap. They really felt that Charles Lynch was in no danger of anything at this point, or serious implications from the shot, because they took the bullet out. He was fine. They did know it hit close to the artery. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of Blinky Morgan. He was a desperate and determined man. He was 45 to 50 years old, stood 5 feet, 8 inches tall, was slightly bald on the top of his head. And I love how the news reports him that he had large black side whiskers, probably colored. Was the brother-in-law of Mrs. F.D. Williams, was said to have killed 7 men, and the news compared him to Jesse James. He was definitely not a good person. I will say that while he was the brother-in-law of Mrs. Williams, Williams denies that he is. And that was reported in the news. Next slide for me. because we can't tell one side of the story without getting the other. We learned that you have to have all sides. So here's what Morgan says. He was just standing there arranging some flowers with one of the children in the house. He saw the child look up, startled, looked around and saw all these men ambushing his house. He grabbed his revolver and fired 2 shots before being taken to jail. So that's his story. He was just doing nothing wrong. Next slide, please. They transported him down. They had patrol wagons. I'm going to show you on the next slide a picture of patrol wagons. I'm going to kind of breeze through this because this part's not the important part of the story. And the next slide for me, please. And the next slide. Blinky Morgan in court. So Charles was still recovering from his injury. So Under Sheriff Denton took the stand in Ohio for the capture of Blinky Morgan. Morgan, with his cold gray eye and firm set jaws, bit defiance to everyone, while Coughlin, with his pale face and dejected air, tends to draw the sympathy of the beholder. And the next slide for me, please. As the trial went on, and the trial lasted 8 days, Blinky started to get more and more nervous. All of the passengers on the train identified him as one of the men who rescued the prisoner. So I'm going to stop because I think I skipped an important part in this story. When Blinky was captured, he was captured for the fur robbery and the death of Detective Hulligan for that brutal beating. So when he was sent back to Ohio, he needed to stand trial for both of those crimes. And that was what was going on here. So the passengers all identified Morgan as that gentleman. And 2 people, including the Reverend Carl Weiss, testified that it was Morgan himself who had struck Hulligan with the coupling pin. So the trial lasts more than 8 days. And on the next slide, November 2nd, 1887, at 11 o'clock, the jury found that Blinky Morgan was guilty of murder in the 1st degree, and the jury was out just 1 hour. Blinky Morgan was sentenced, and if you go 2 slides forward for me, please. The news included a depiction of the hanging of Blinky. What's very interesting is he wanted his body donated to science and then cremated afterward. And then they were notified later by one of Blinky's reputed mistresses that she wanted the body sent to her since she had been refused to see him in his last moments alive. Blinky asked the physician to relinquish his claim, and it was granted. So his mistress had him buried later. So go ahead and go to the next slide for me, please. So we're going to go forward a couple. We're going to skip a couple things. And we're going to talk about who Charles Lynch was. Next slide, please. Charles was born in 1850, March 23rd, and he was a citizen of Alpena since 1866. He worked in the lumbering business for several years. And during that time, he proved to be very popular and gained public confidence very easily. He had the qualities that made a first-class sheriff, being brave, cool, self-possessed, and not easily excited. Next slide. One of our Alpena bondsmen said, "I have known the sheriff since he was a young boy. He was a deputy sheriff of Alpena 2 years ago, and then he was elected sheriff. He is a resolute, shrewd, and brave man. He worked for years in the lumber camps of northern Michigan and had considerable experience with what is probably the roughest men in the country. He is very popular in this town, and if he sets out to do anything, you can depend upon its accomplishment at any cost, and he is worthy all of the credit he may receive." Next couple of slides, please. I always like to ask, how do you want to be remembered? Charles Lynch was remembered for a lot of different things, but he died by inches. So as time went on, that bullet wound, the hole in his leg, the placement of where it was next to the artery, it kept getting worse and worse and worse, even though it should be getting better and better and better. And part of that was because they cleaned out the wound and they sewed it shut. They let it heal from the outside with letting the inside fester. So the injury keeps getting worse, but he doesn't complain. He doesn't ask for medication. He doesn't ask for painkillers, except a little whiskey to flavor his milk every now and then. And the next slide for me, please. Fortunately, in August, he perished from that wound. And the way they report it, he passed out of the weariness of his sufferings at 11 o'clock Wednesday morning. And he was surrounded by his wife, his oldest son, and some of Alpena's finest. In fact, the wound had swelled so much that the wound burst. It was horrendous. Next slide, please. The news of the fur robbers, the capture, the trial, all of that was national news. So when the Sheriff Lynch died, it made the New York Times. Next slide for me, please. It's important that the coroner was able to find that Lynch had died from the wound of Blinky Morgan. So basically, he had developed necrosis of the bone and the coats of the artery burst, causing a dangerous hemorrhage. They tied off his artery, but he had developed blood poisoning, and that's ultimately what he died from. Next slide, please. Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of sheriff, the undersheriff took over and then continued for a few more years and even took over again later in the 1890s. Next slide, please. This was one of the largest funerals that our town had ever seen. The casket was placed in the hall in front of the stairway leading to the courtroom. So it was at the courthouse was his viewing. The display included the most beautiful and elaborate floral display ever made. At the head of a coffin, or of his coffin, was a broken column, at least 7 feet high, composed of evergreens and flowers. Take note of this monument that we will talk about here. And the next slide for me, please. I included a photo of the courthouse. You could have a little perspective of, you can put yourself in the place of one of Alpena's community going to the courthouse that day to pay their respects to the sheriff. The next slide, please. I have an image of a funeral procession. This procession is actually from 1920, but you get the same concept. Alpena didn't look that much different then. Next slide for me, please. The funeral was held at the First Congregational Church. In the First Congregational Church's first church structure, they're currently on their third. The procession was led down Chisholm to the church at 2nd and Lockwood. There was not enough room in the church, so most of the people had to stand outside. The procession resumed, and there were 50 to 100 carriages at the beginning, and by the time they reached the cemetery, there was almost 150. The next slide, please, is just another view from the courthouse. This perspective is everything. And the next slide for me is the record of the sheriff's death. And if you look there in the red box, died from wound of Blinky Morgan. And this shook the town. It absolutely did. The next slide for me. So Mrs. Lynch is left with 4 boys who are now left without their father. And she's trying to figure out how to keep the family afloat and move forward. And so a local artist who had a shop at the Centennial Building, is that correct? And he wanted to help Mrs. Lynch out. So he did this giant painting. How big was the painting, Mike?
It was 5 by 7.
5 by 7. And it was depicting the capture of Charles storming in the house, Blinky firing his gun. It was meant to be a very theatric painting. And they put it on display with?
All the articles that were involved in the arrest. Blinky's gun, the handcuffs.
So we had Blinky's gun, the handcuffs, everything that was involved in the arrest. And it was inside the Centennial Building, and the people could go every day this week, which was March 13th, 1889, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. They could pay a little bit, see the depiction, and all the money that was raised went to Mrs. Lynch and her boys. Next slide, please. So the community really rallied for them, and I think that's wonderful. So we'll talk, next slide for me, about Morgan's reaction. On August 17th, 1887, a deputy sheriff down in Ohio broke the news to Blinky that Charles had died. And Morgan says, "Is that so?" Days before the sheriff had died, Morgan was found yelling in his cell. Who wouldn't have shot him? It served him right. How did I know I was being beset upon by a gang of men that might be robbers? Any sane man would have fired. So you can see that it was getting to him. It was getting to him that this had happened. And it's weird because up until this point, he hadn't had any remorse, any feeling for anyone else he had murdered. So I think this part is interesting too, because someone says, why would an innocent, law-abiding man have 2 loaded revolvers on his person in the house of his host? Next slide, because Blinky had no answer. So we're going to talk about that reward money. At the very beginning, you saw that photo that there was $16,000 for the capture of all 4 men and the conviction. Well, not all of them are yes.
I just wanted to point out that $16,000 equates to 400.
So Mike just said that $16,000 equates to $400,000 in 2022. That is a very large chunk of change. And that was for the capture of all 4 and their conviction. Well, unfortunately, not all 4 were captured. I think one, the original one they had broken out, had never been captured. But there was still reward money that was due to our town and the Lynch family. So next slide for me, please. Cleveland officials, the Michigan Sheriff's Association, they were rallying for that money to go to widow Lynch and her 4 children. But Alpena, everyone that was involved in the capture felt that they had a stake in that money too, and they deserved a piece of it. So no one could find a solid answer as to who that money went to. So next slide for me. As far as I can tell in the research I've done, I don't think that money was ever dispersed. Unfortunately, next slide for me, please. And the next slide. Anna wound up dying less than 2 years after Charles did, and I truly think it was from a broken heart. She faced hardship after hardship after hardship, and then she passed away as well and left behind all 4 sons. And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Mike to talk about Charles's final resting place, the restoration of the stone that sits there, and the fact that Charles has absolutely no headstone. But real quick, because if you could fast forward about 5 slides for me, hold on. A few more. Yep. And one more for me. Up until last year, we never had a photo of Charles, and this is really probably my life's greatest accomplishment at this point. Right? But we had never had a photo of Charles ever. They had one at one time, but it had people just, everyone knew who he was, and then suddenly no one knew who he was as generations progressed. And last year, as I was preparing for a presentation to the Genealogical Society, I was digging through newly digitized newspapers from Ohio. And in one of them, they posted this sketch of our late sheriff. So I thought, if this is all I ever have, I will be so happy. So I called Mike up immediately. I'm never going to believe it. I found a picture. Well, it's a sketch, but it's close enough. And he says, I have some news. And he was on his way out of town, and you turned around and met me at the library and said that in his years of volunteering at the Besser Museum, he had come across the next photo and had always had this gut feeling that it was the late sheriff. But there was no identification on the photo, and we had no way to prove it, so he had never told me about it. And so he has this photo saved on his phone, quickly and easily accessible. And if you go to the next slide for me, you'll see that I'm pretty sure this sketch was done from this photograph. And the news reports that he was so sick when this photo was taken that they had to prop him up in bed because he was so weak, but he wouldn't let that get to him. So you can see here, and I just want you to see him because I never want him to be forgotten. And I want to thank Julie Riddle too for doing that article in the newspaper a couple weeks ago, because some of you are here because of that article. And it finally put his name and face in the Alpena news for the first time. So I'm going to now definitely turn it over to Mike, and he's going to talk about the restoration.
That's what we like to hear, that confirmation.
Absolutely, yes.
Hello, my name is Mike Phillips, and I'm a member of Granite Gardens. Amanda Kuznicki and Danyeal Dorr are my partners. And we, due to COVID, we were quarantined, and we realized that we could go to the cemetery and safely stay apart and talk and do what we do, which is discuss history. And the cemetery is one tombstone of history after another. So we found ourselves in front of the grave of the little young Japanese boy who had died. And it's a beautiful marker. And he died at 2 years old, and his family were in a circus, and they had to leave town like a week after they buried their son in our cemetery. His dad later had a monument made, and it was erected, and they moved to Japan, never to return. So along we come, and the thing was in a state of disrepair, and we decided to restore it. So having done that, you know, it looked great. We were so happy, you know, we adopted this young boy. So we looked for the next one, and I brought up Sheriff Lynch. So we found where he was supposed to be, and all we found was a tombstone with just a little bit of marble showing through the grass. It was almost completely buried. And I assumed that was what we were looking for. But when I looked closer, it was that of an infant, and the date didn't match. So upon more research, we found that Sheriff Lynch never got a tombstone. So we decided that we were going to remedy that. So we did our research, and by then Kat was already well into what she was working on. And I'd just like to add a small caveat that Blinky Morgan has a tombstone and had it right after he died. You know, they buried him. So we took it upon ourselves to do that. We lifted the infant's tombstone, cleaned it, made a frame, and set it on a bed of crushed marble just to protect it. And that's what's there now. The sheriff was buried right on top of him. And one thing led to another. We had history hay wagon rides in the cemetery, and we had workshops on how to successfully clean tombstones and preserve them. And one thing led to another. With the help of Crow Memorial, we designed a tombstone that was symbolic of what was at his funeral, a broken column, which is symbolic of a life cut short. So before I knew it, Crow Memorial had everything in the works. They were ready to go. And we just said, well, all right, let's do it. So that project is actually being worked on right now. And we're out trying to raise funds to you know, get it erected this summer. And we plan on having a memorial dedication. And with some of the money that we can raise, we're going to fly his descendants to Alpena to participate in the dedication memorial. So that's where we are. We hope you'll donate. I've given you pamphlets. I'd like you to tell your friends, leave them in conspicuous places. I've got lots of them, and we just want to flood Alpena with them and get this story told. And that's all we have today. And this is a mock-up of the monument that's going to be built. It'll be a black granite on the bottom and then fluted column on the top. It's going to be, this is actual size. So it's an exact representation of what we believe was at his funeral as it was described in the Alpena Argus in 1887.
Everyone go to FB and look for the location. It's right, almost right inside those three gates. So make sure you stay close to the gate. You'll see our little wooden frame around.
How much family is there? I've only been able to track down the oldest son's last living relatives, so it's like two great grandsons. One lives in the south and one lives out on the east coast. It's where it's separated. Dropped it out. We're not after that. Which is also very sad.
Did they know the history of your fund?
They had little bits and pieces of it. Oh, did the children or do the current descendants? Yes. They knew bits and pieces of the story, but not nearly in this much detail, and they've been involved with us every step of the way. You know, they're a really cool family. So I call them up, I'm like, hey, this is what we're working on, this is what I found. And they were sharing their research with me, I was sharing mine with them in an effort to find a photo, but they didn't have one, so now they do, and that to me is huge.
Yeah.
Yes.
This community deserves to remember what it did.
Please, I had Michigan history at Alpena Community College back in the early 60s.
Okay, back in your Michigan history class.
A lawyer taught at Alpena College. He was dedicated to history.
Oh, I love that. It's important for the story to be told. I think that there were so many tragedies that happened from the sheriff was shot and then the progression of his injury and then the death of his wife and the fact that he had no headstone, that we haven't had a photo. So when I hear that teachers were still teaching this in the 50s, and I know that Mr. Capeless, who teaches Alpena history at the high school now, that's how we'll keep the story alive. So we wonder the same thing, and I think eventually that's something that I will definitely continue researching, and I know other people have a vested interest too, because that's very well something that we could maybe still claim and apply to his monument.
Another fun fact is his wife isn't buried with him. She's buried across the street
a
at the
great fact.
Holy Cross. So even then, they didn't have the funds to even put them in a plot together. She's buried with her family, which you discovered.
Yes, I went there after the cemetery had closed for the night. It was about midnight, and I had found in the cemetery records, and it's actually a little peaceful there that time of night, I'll say. My mom thought I was crazy. Yeah, exactly. Any other questions?
Solving a puzzle.
Absolutely. It very much is like solving a puzzle, and this, it is. I could talk about that for all day. And just like all these puzzles that you guys keep solving and these headstones that you keep restoring and these lost stories and these lost souls that, you know, if you didn't restore their headstone, they would be lost to time too.
literally crumble into the ground with the stones themselves. So now, mind you, when we're restoring these stones, we are getting permission. This isn't something we're not just walking up to somebody's family stone and messing around with it, that kind of thing. It's either stones that have long passed the limitation or so family left, or that we've gotten permission specifically from the family itself to work on these stones. So it's very important in cemetery preservation, as you always seek permission from either your local ordinance, your city, the family, however. So that's a little side note I wanted to plug in there too. So, and go to our cemetery, look at the names, and then pick up one of the Town That Wouldn't Dies or one of the 6 gleanings that Robert Haltiner has written, and just enjoy yourself. There's so much history just in those little pages, just from the fronts of tombstones. It's incredible. We're kind of passionate. So if you look at a Evergreen Cemetery map, you'll notice it's numbered with like OA and OB and OC. That O stands for original cemetery. Our original Evergreen Cemetery was a 10-acre plot. Okay. After, when of course the city kept growing, and what happens is we keep deceasing, that's when the lots changed and they kicked the fence back to where it is, and it opened up. So for the first little while, if you ever, in the maps posted right in there, and you'll see it. So anything that's in an O is our beginning. Not the first cemetery location though. Let's remember that. Our first cemetery was where Thunder Bay Manufacturing is today. Right.
All the bodies that were in that old cemetery were exhumed and moved to the cemetery that has the old letter designations. The oldest one we've found that has a date on it is 1869. So it definitely would have been in the old cemetery. So, yes, a lot of them, and a lot of those, from what I understand, the markers didn't make it to where the bodies actually did. There was a lag. So some of them were shuffled a little bit. And now when you go into Evergreen, you see open field, and there are no stones there. And what happens is they fall down, and then over time, the leaves and everything, the dirt builds up around, creates a hole, and then that fills in with leaves, and pretty soon, all there is dirt. That's when the marble tends to dissolve and the story goes away.
We don't always have the equipment to stones have fallen. It's like, yeah, well, thanks for your interest. Now, if you're interested in a class on preservation itself,